Some monsters don't wait until nightfall to crawl out from under the bed. They sit beside you at dinner, hold your hand in prayer, and look just like anyone else who says, "I love you." The story I'm about to share is among the heaviest I've carried in my lifetime, and perhaps among the most difficult you'll ever hear. My name is Eleanor Rose Thompson. I'm 78 years old now, and I've lived with more than 5 decades of silence pressing against my chest like a stone that won't budge. I was born and raised in a quiet patch of rural Georgia, a town so small that secrets echo louder than sermons and family names carry more weight than truth. Around here, most folks just know me as Grandma Ellie, the woman with white curls who sells pies at the Saturday farmers market and never misses church at 6. But very few, almost none, know what I've buried deep inside me since I was 10. Telling this story isn't easy. It shakes something loose in me that I've spent years trying to keep still. But if you're here, I ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. Not for vanity, but to support the courage it takes to speak out loud what was meant to be hidden forever. And please, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd like to feel a little less alone as I finally open this door. I don't tell this story for myself. I've already learned to live with the scars. I speak today for all the children past and present whose innocence was taken by the very hands that were supposed to protect them. Maybe, just maybe, if someone hears this, they'll choose to act sooner, before silence becomes a life sentence. Back then, our house was a modest blue wooden home with a porch just wide enough for 3 flower pots. My mother filled them with red geraniums that spilled over the edges like laughter in the summertime. We didn't have much, but we had enough. My father, Ernest, worked sunup to sundown in the cotton fields. My mother, Caroline, ran the house with grace and baked pies to sell around town. I was the eldest of 3. Paul came 2 years after me. And little Rosie, sweet and wild, had just turned 5. Life was hard. Yes, but we were content in our own way. Until the day May 12th, 1957, when everything shattered. Ours was a family of modest means. Like most around those parts, we didn't have riches, but our days were stitched together with simple comforts: warm bread fresh from the oven, laughter under the sun, and stories whispered beneath patchwork quilts at bedtime. My father, Ernest, was a man of few words but strong hands. Every morning, before the first light dared to touch the horizon, he was already gone to the fields. He returned long after the stars had claimed the sky, his boots muddy, his face streaked with sweat, but his eyes always soft when he looked at us. My mother, Caroline, was the quiet center of our world. She didn't need to speak much to make you feel safe. She baked not only for us, but for the neighbors too. Her pies and bread known for miles around. She taught me how to knead dough and measure ingredients by feel, not by numbers. The hands know, she used to say, and somehow, they did. I was the firstborn, and that meant something in our house. It meant responsibility. It meant keeping the younger ones in line, helping Mama when she was tired, and stepping up when Papa was out. I didn't mind it. I loved my siblings fiercely. Paul was 2 years younger than me. All mischief and wide eyes. He had a mind for adventure. Always climbing trees he shouldn't or chasing frogs in the creek. Rosie, the baby of the family, had just turned 5. She had hair like golden silk and a voice that always seemed to sing. Even when she spoke, our days were marked by honest labor and little joys. We swam in the creek when the heat became too much to bear. We drank lemonade on the porch while Mama told us tales of her childhood, and Papa carved small wooden animals by lamplight in the evenings. We didn't know we were poor. That's the thing about happiness in its purest form. It doesn't need permission from the world. until that spring day came. And with it, something far darker than any of us could have imagined. It was a gray morning, the kind that feels like the world forgot to wake up. A fine drizzle had been falling since before dawn, soaking the earth and turning the dirt roads into slippery veins of red mud. I remember waking earlier than usual, not to the sound of birdsong, but to a ragged, unfamiliar coughing. It came from the next room, my parents' bedroom. It wasn't the kind of cough one gets from dust or a chill. It was deep, wet, and frightening, like something inside was tearing loose. I crept out of bed, careful not to wake Rosie, and padded barefoot across the creaky wooden floor. When I opened the door to their room, what I saw made my stomach twist. Mama was lying in bed, pale and flushed at the same time, her forehead slick with sweat. Her lips had a strange bluish tint that I wouldn't understand until much later cyanosis. The doctors would call it. Back then, it just looked wrong. "Mama," I whispered, edging closer. "Are you okay?" She turned her head toward me and tried to smile, but even that small effort made her grimace. "Just the flu. My flower," she rasped. "It'll pass." But it didn't pass. Her breathing grew shallow, her chest rising and falling like she was fighting for every bit of air. I stood there frozen, wanting to believe her words, but fear was already creeping into the edges of my mind. Normally, by then, Papa would have been in the cotton fields, but the rain had kept him home that morning. When he came in and saw Mama's condition, his face changed. All the strength and steadiness I was used to seeing drained away, replaced by something I'd never seen on him before. Panic. "I'm taking her to the hospital," he said, already wrapping her in blankets. "Fairview's closest." That was the next town over, 20 miles down, a winding road that could barely hold a car in dry weather, let alone on a day like this. "Ellie." He turned to me, his voice low but firm. "Watch your brother and sister until I get back." At the time, my grandfather, my father's father, was living with us. His name was August Thompson. He had moved in about 8 months prior, after my grandmother passed away quietly in her sleep one chilly November night. Since then, he'd taken a quiet seat in our lives, like an old piece of furniture, always there, solid and impossible to move. He was a tall man, even in his late 60s, with broad shoulders and thick, weathered hands that bore the map of decades spent laboring in the fields. His mustache was always neatly trimmed, silver like his hair, and his gaze cold. Assessing seemed to peel the layers off every soul in the room. He didn't smile often, and when he did, it never quite reached his eyes. "I'll keep watch over the children," he told my father as they prepared to leave. He placed a heavy hand on Papa's shoulder, like it was some kind of solemn pact. "Go tend to Caroline. We'll be just fine here." Papa hesitated, glancing at me. I knew he was worried about leaving us, but there was no time to argue. The rain kept falling, steady and uncaring. With Mama wrapped in blankets, he lifted her gently in his arms and carried her out to the old pickup truck that waited in the yard, its paint dulled by years of sun and storms. I stood by the window and watched through the glass fogged by my breath. Her face, pale against the dark wool, turned one last time toward me. "Take care of your brother and sister, Ellie," she whispered, her voice barely carried, drowned almost entirely by the sound of rain against the tin roof. But I heard it. Words spoken as a promise I would spend years trying and failing to keep. The screen door slammed shut behind them. The truck engine groaned to life and disappeared into the mist. I was left standing in the quiet house, holding tight to Rosie's hand as Paul looked up at me with uncertain eyes. I wanted to be brave for them. I tried, but deep down, Something cold had already begun to settle in my bones. That day felt like it would never end. Time slowed, stretching out each hour until it felt like days were passing between one moment and the next. I tried to keep everything as normal as I could for Paul, for Rosie, and maybe for myself too. I made us a simple lunch with what Mama had left, prepared cornbread, a few boiled eggs, and blackberry jam. We sat at the kitchen table like we always did. Though the house felt too quiet, too hollow, Paul was unusually calm. He kept glancing at the window as if waiting for Papa's truck to come back down the muddy road. Rosie, too young to understand anything beyond what she could see, hummed to herself and played with her doll under the table. Grandfather spent most of the afternoon out on the porch. He sat in his usual spot, puffing his pipe, his gaze lost in the curtain of rain that never let up. He didn't say much, only coming inside now and then to ask if everything was under control. His voice never rose above a murmur, and his expression remained unreadable, cold, detached, almost mechanical. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe he was worried. Maybe that was just how old men dealt with fear. Or maybe he already knew more than I realized. As the sky darkened into late afternoon, my worry grew heavier. Why weren't they back yet? Was the road worse than we thought? Had Mama gotten sicker, was she? I shook that thought away. I couldn't let it in. I had to stay strong, just like she'd asked me to. By 7:00 p.m., I had bathed Rosie and Paul and tucked them into bed. Paul clung to me longer than usual, asking questions I didn't know how to answer. Rosie drifted off easily, cradled by the same bedtime story Mama always used to tell about the girl who turned into a bird to fly above the clouds. Then it was just me, waiting, watching the windows, listening to the rain. It was almost 9:00 when I finally heard it, the crunch of tires in the soaked dirt. I ran to the window, hope pounding in my chest. But what I saw made my breath catch. Papa was alone. As soon as Papa stepped through the door, soaked from head to toe, I knew something was terribly wrong. His shoulders slumped forward as if the rain had soaked into his bones. And his face, oh, his face was the face of a man carrying grief too heavy to speak. He closed the door behind him slowly, removed his hat, and held it against his chest like he was in church. Or at a funeral. "Where's Mama?" I asked. Even though part of me already knew. He tried to speak, but his mouth trembled. He looked down at the floor for a moment before forcing the words through cracked lips. "She didn't make it. Ellie," he said softly. "Pneumonia. It was already too far along. There was nothing they could do." The words hit like a hammer to the chest. Gone, just like that. That morning she was still here, trying to smile through the fever, still calling me her flower. How could someone disappear from your life between sunrise and sundown? I couldn't cry. Not right away. It was like the tears were stuck behind a dam of disbelief. Papa pulled me into a tight embrace, his wet clothes chilling against mine. But I didn't flinch. I needed to feel something, anything that would make this real. We stood there in silence, just holding each other, while the rain continued to drum against the windows like a cruel lullaby. From the kitchen doorway, my grandfather watched us. His face was unreadable, not sorrowful, not surprised, just blank, as if this loss was no more than a passing inconvenience. After a long while, Papa finally spoke again. "They're making arrangements," he said. "I'll bring her home in the morning." Then he looked me in the eyes. "You're going to have to be strong, Ellie. For Paul, for Rosie." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure how. I was just 10. But he was looking at me like I was already grown. And somehow, in that moment, I became what he needed me to be. "Go get some rest, son." My grandfather told Papa after a few more silent moments. The road was long, and tomorrow will be harder still. I'll keep an eye on the little ones with Ellie. Papa didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on me. Unsure. Maybe he sensed something. Maybe not. But the exhaustion etched into every line of his face eventually won. He gave me one last squeeze. Whispered, "Try to sleep, sweetheart," and walked to the bedroom he had once shared with Mama. I could hear his quiet sobs through the thin wooden walls long into the night. I stayed in the kitchen, sitting at the table, the one Mama used to knead dough on every morning. I stared at nothing, listening to the rain tap a steady rhythm on the roof. Grandfather sat across from me, not saying a word, just poured himself a glass of whiskey from the bottle we kept for visitors. He didn't offer any condolences. No kind words. Just silence. Heavy and cold. After a while, he poured another glass and pushed it toward me. "Have a sip," he said. "Takes the edge off the pain." I stared at it. I'd never touched alcohol in my life. Mama wouldn't have approved. But Mama wasn't here anymore. And the ache in my chest felt like it might consume me if I didn't do anything to numb it. So I took the glass. One small sip, the liquid burned down my throat. Hot and bitter, making my eyes water. He poured more. I drank again. And again. "Good girl," he muttered. I don't remember how many times the glass was filled. Only that the world started to blur. My head heavy. My thoughts slow and tangled. At some point, he stood up, walked to my side, and placed a hand on my back. "Come now," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Let's get you to bed." But he didn't lead me to the room I shared with Rosie. He took me to his. The rest of that night exists only in fragments, sharp, scattered pieces I tried to bury for decades. I remember confusion, a heaviness in my limbs, the smell of whiskey on his breath, the scent of pipe smoke clinging to the fabric of his shirt, his voice in my ear, low and rasping, telling me not to be afraid, that this was how things were now. I remember hands that shouldn't have touched me, pain that I didn't understand, a weight pressing down on me, smothering me, my voice trying to form words that wouldn't come out. And the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the betrayal. The knowledge that someone who should have protected me was the very one who destroyed the safety of my world. At some point, I must have passed out. The next thing I clearly remember was morning light creeping through the cracks in the wooden walls. Soft and golden, I was back in my bed beside Rosie, who still slept soundly, her little fists curled under her chin, unaware of the storm that had torn through our home. For a brief second, I let myself believe it had all been a terrible dream, that Mama was still alive, that everything was still normal, that the ache in my body was just from sleeping wrong. But then I shifted, and pain flared. I saw the bruises forming on my arms, felt the raw sting in places I couldn't name, and on the sheet beneath me, a stain of blood. No, it hadn't been a dream. It was real. Everything was real. And Mama was really gone. And in the same day I lost her. I also lost something else, my childhood. My innocence. My belief that love and safety went hand in hand. That morning, something inside me hardened. I stood up carefully, trying not to wake Rosie. I changed my clothes, splashed water on my face from the basin. Then I looked in the mirror hanging on the wall. The girl staring back at me had my face. But the eyes were older. So much older. Something had closed in me forever. I went to the kitchen that morning like Mama used to. I boiled water for coffee, laid out bread, and lit the small stove to warm the room. Today would be the wake. People would come. The house needed to look like life still lived here. Papa was already awake when I entered the room. He sat at the table, Eyes swollen, face drawn tight with a night of grief. When he saw me, he gave a tired smile and opened his arms. I went to him, and he wrapped me in another one of those quiet hugs that tried to say what words could not. I wanted to scream, to tell him what had happened, to beg him to never leave me alone with his father again. But the words wouldn't come. They froze in my throat like ice. I was 10, and already I had learned how to silence myself. "I'm going to bring your mother home now," he said softly, stroking my hair. "Take care of the little ones when they wake." I nodded. That was my job now, wasn't it? The house soon filled with neighbors, cousins, old friends of Mama's, people I barely recognized. They brought food casseroles, biscuits, pies, hams. It was the way grief worked in our town, feed the living vive. Honor the dead. Rosie wore a white dress and a ribbon in her hair. Paul held my hand through the whole thing. He didn't ask questions that day. He just stayed close, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Rosie kept asking when Mama was going to wake up. Each time, the question landed like a knife in my chest. The casket was simple pine. Nothing fancy. Mama looked like a doll someone had placed too carefully, too still. Her hands folded on her chest. Her hair brushed back just so. She didn't look like the woman who sang over bread dough or danced barefoot with us in the rain. And my grandfather, he stood to the side, accepting condolences like a man, with no burden. His eyes found mine only once, and when they did, I looked away. After the funeral, the visits began to slow. The casseroles stopped coming. The front porch, once full of voices and footsteps, returned to silence. Grief, I learned, is loud at first, but eventually it retreats into whispers, into quiet corners no one else dares look into. Papa threw himself into work. Each morning, before the sun was fully up, he left for the fields, and each night he came home, bone-tired, barely speaking, eating quickly, and going straight to bed. He carried his pain like a sack of rocks on his shoulders, heavy and silent. And me, I did what I thought was expected. I became the little mother. I got up before the others to start the fire, cooked what I remembered from watching Mama, dressed Paul and Rosie for school, scrubbed the laundry against the stone washboard, swept the floors, and tried to keep everything running. But nothing tasted the same. The beans weren't seasoned right. The bread refused to rise. The clothes never smelled as fresh. I tried to mimic Mama's rhythm, but it was like playing a song I didn't know by heart. At night, when the house was dark and quiet, I would bury my face in the pillow and cry silently so I wouldn't wake Rosie. I cried for Mama, for myself, for the weight on my shoulders that felt too big for such a small frame. But most of all, I cried for the terror that came every time I was left alone with my grandfather. Because after that first night, it didn't stop. He became calculated, patient. He waited for moments when Papa went to town, when the kids were away, when the house stood still. "Come help me with something," he'd say in that low, commanding voice. And I'd go, my heart pounding, because I didn't think I had a choice. I was 10 years old, and I was already living a nightmare that no one saw. After that first night, the monster didn't disappear. He just learned to hide better. He became careful, measured. No more whiskey. No more late-night invitations. Now he waited until the house was quiet, until Papa had gone into town, until Paul and Rosie were down by the creek or off at school. Then came the knock on the doorframe, the call from the tool shed, the voice from the barn. "Ellie, come help me." And every time, my body went cold. I'd feel my stomach drop, but I still went because I didn't know how not to. because saying no wasn't an option when the voice demanding it came from someone the world said you should respect. Each time, I disappeared a little more. Afterwards, he always said the same thing. This stays between us. Your father's got enough grief. You don't want to make it worse for him. Do you? He used my love for Papa as a weapon, twisting it into something that held me hostage. I believed him. Believed that if I spoke up, I'd break my father apart, that I would be the one who ruined everything left of our already fragile family. So I stayed quiet. I carried that silence like a curse. No one noticed. Not the neighbors. Not the teachers. Not the church ladies who dropped off pies and patted me on the head. No one saw the girl who had already lost more than her age could bear. Because in our world, children didn't have a voice. Especially not when the one who hurt them shared their blood. And monsters didn't always come with claws and fangs. Sometimes, they came in the form of a grandfather who smelled of pipe smoke and said grace before every meal. Winter came hard that year. The frost crept into our fields each morning like a silent thief, painting everything white before the sun could melt it away. The nights were so cold, we could see our breath even inside the house, huddled under thick quilts. And for once, I didn't mind the cold. The layers of sweaters, the thick stockings, the coats, each one was a barrier, a shield between me and him. I began to rely on the cold, welcome it even, because it gave me time to bundle up, to hide, to disappear under fabric and layers that dulled the threat I couldn't escape. By then, I had learned how to vanish in plain sight. I stopped looking people in the eyes. I stopped laughing. I did what I had to do, moving through the world like a ghost in a child's body. But inside, I had become an expert at surviving. I found small ways to fight back, not loud, not visible, but real to me. I started sleeping with scissors under my pillow. I learned to wake earlier than everyone else, so I could lock the bedroom door before he had the chance to open it. I faked being sick on days when I knew we'd be alone. I hid in the loft above the barn, a place I discovered one day by accident and kept secret like treasure. It didn't always work, but even the illusion of control helped. And I developed a kind of silence that wasn't weakness, it was strategy. I became a watcher. I learned to read the shift in his posture, the glint in his eyes, the way his footsteps changed when he drank too much. I learned when to stay close to Rosie, when to linger near neighbors, when to disappear. These were my weapons. Not enough to stop him, but enough to keep pieces of myself intact. In August of that year, I turned 11. But what should have been a simple birthday, a slice of cake, a candle, maybe a hug came with something else. Something I didn't ask for and didn't want. My body started to change. Small buds of pain bloomed on my chest. I didn't know what they meant at first, only that they made me ache and that clothes started to feel tight in strange places. I was growing up. Too soon. Too fast. And he noticed, turning into a little woman. "Aren't you?" he said one morning, his eyes lingering in a way that made my skin crawl. He looked at me differently now, like he was waiting for something. "You take after your mother," he added, his voice low, almost like a secret. She was early too. I felt sick. I began to hide my body, wearing loser dresses, binding myself with fabric under my clothes, hunching my shoulders to appear smaller. Anything to disappear inside myself, to become invisible. But it didn't help. His gaze still found me. That summer was heavy with heat and dread. The days stretched long, each one more unbearable than the last. But then something changed, something unexpected. We began getting regular visits from my father's cousin, Aunt Louise, a widow in her 50s. She lived in town and had always been somewhat distant, but after Mama's death, She started coming more often on Sundays, mostly bringing pound cakes and pickles, and staying long enough to ask real questions. She had sharp eyes. Aunt Louise. Eyes that saw more than they let on. "This girl's too thin," she once said to Papa. "And those eyes, those aren't a child's eyes anymore." She was the first person to notice. And suddenly, I didn't know whether to be terrified or hopeful. Aunt Louise began visiting more often after Mama passed. At first, she'd just drop off a pie or a jar of preserves, staying for a few minutes before heading back into town. But then the visits got longer. She'd sit in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, asking quiet questions, watching us move through the house like shadows. Her eyes lingered longer on me than on Paul or Rosie. She didn't say much, but I could feel it. She was noticing. She had that kind of gaze that made your skin itch, not because it was unkind, but because it saw too much. The first time she asked how I was sleeping, I froze. "Fine," I said, looking down. "You don't look fine," she replied gently. "You look tired, baby." I didn't answer. I just kept washing dishes, hoping the silence would make her stop. But she didn't. She kept coming every Sunday. Sometimes during the week, she brought socks for Rosie, books for Paul, tea for Papa. She offered to help around the house, and sometimes stayed late into the afternoon. That's when I noticed something else. My grandfather didn't like it. He grew quieter whenever she was around. Watched her like a snake might watch a hawk. He stopped calling for me when she was in the house. His footsteps faded more cautiously down the hall. And just like that, the dynamic shifted. He wasn't the only watcher anymore. By early spring, I had stopped hoping he'd leave me alone. I knew better. But I also knew something else. He wasn't as bold as before. Not with Aunt Louise around. Not with Papa staying home more often. Not when eyes started to notice what had once gone unseen. And so I began to fight, not with fists or shouting, but with silence and strategy. I started hiding in plain sight. Whenever he came near, I'd disappear to the barn loft, to the woodshed, behind the laundry line. I memorized every corner where he couldn't reach me quickly. I made excuses. "I need to help Rosie. Papa asked me to gather eggs. My hands are sore today." Little things. Harmless things. But each time I said no and walked away, I reclaimed something, however small. I also began to watch him. Just like he had watched me. I noted the twitch in his jaw when someone asked him about his day, the shift in his voice when Aunt Louise arrived, the way his hands tightened when Papa lingered too long near me. He was losing control. And I could feel it. Still, the fear never left. It sat in my belly like a coiled snake. But I learned to live around it, to build walls from routine and distraction, to turn fear into focus. Most nights, I slept with my shoes on and my coat folded at the end of the bed just in case I needed to run. And every day, I told myself he doesn't get to win. Not this time. It happened in March of 1958. The sky was overcast, and the air had that heavy stillness that came before a storm. Papa had gone into town for supplies. Rosie and Paul were down at the creek with a neighbor's boy. I was alone in the house. I felt it coming before it happened. The house had that strange, too quiet feel, the kind that makes your skin tighten. I was folding laundry when I heard the footsteps slow, deliberate, coming down the hall. He called my name. I didn't answer. I heard the creak of the floorboards outside the room, the knob on the door turning. I grabbed for the nearest thing, an iron, still warm from the fire, and clutched it like a weapon. The door opened. He stepped in, closing it softly behind him. I backed away, clutching the iron to my chest, my breath shallow. He looked at me, not angry, not wild, just calm. Certain. like he had all the time in the world. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. And then, the front door slammed. Heavy boots on wood. Papa's voice. Calling out, "Ellie, you here?" My grandfather froze. I saw it just for a second, fear flickering behind his eyes. Then he straightened, turned on his heel, and walked out as if nothing had happened. I dropped the iron. My knees gave out. I sat there shaking, unable to breathe. Papa never saw it. Never guessed how close he'd come to saving me in the exact moment I needed saving most. But that day changed something. From then on, I knew it wasn't impossible. That interruptions could happen. That there were cracks in the monster's world. And maybe, just maybe, one day I'd be able to slip through them for good. After that day in March, something shifted in Papa. He started watching me differently. Not in a suspicious way, more like he was finally seeing the cracks I'd been hiding. At breakfast, he'd glance at the bruise on my arm and pause. Not long, just a second. But I saw it. At night, when I winced getting into bed, his eyes would flick toward me, quiet and uncertain. He didn't say anything, but the silence felt louder. One afternoon, I dropped a jar in the kitchen. It shattered across the floor. I flinched, already bracing for the voice I hated most, my grandfather's. But instead, I heard Papa's boots coming down the hall. He knelt beside me, gently brushing glass away from my hands. "Don't touch that, sweetheart. You'll cut yourself." I nodded, eyes downcast. Then, his fingers lightly touched the bruise on my wrist. "This happened in the barn?" he asked. I froze. My breath caught. "Just fell," I whispered. He didn't push, just nodded and stood. But that night, I heard him arguing with grandfather on the porch. Low voices, heated tones. Papa rarely raised his voice, but that night, it trembled with something dangerous. "You treat her like glass," grandfather snapped. "No," Papa said coldly. "I treat her like she matters." From then on, the house was no longer quiet. It was tense, thin, like something was about to break. And I realized Papa was starting to see the truth. He didn't know all of it yet, but the shadows were creeping out of the corners. Whether I was ready or not, it happened on a night that smelled like rain. The wind rattled the windows. Rosie and Paul were already asleep. And I was finishing the dishes when I heard the creak of the floorboards behind me. I didn't turn. I knew that sound too well. His hand brushed my back. I froze. His breath hit the side of my neck, and I gripped the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles turned white. "Just a moment, sweetheart," he whispered. But before he could move closer, the back door slammed open. "Get your damn hands off her." It was Papa. His voice was like thunder, heavy, final. My grandfather stumbled backward, eyes wide, caught in the act. For a second, no one moved. The room pulsed with silence. Then Papa Lunget. He slammed into the old man with such force that both of them crashed into the table. Wood cracked. A chair toppled. Rosie began to scream from the hallway. "Stay upstairs," I shouted. "Stay with Paul," but I couldn't look away. Fists flew. Grunts. Curses. The sound of pain and fury colliding. Papa was shouting words I couldn't understand, pure rage spilling from years of guilt and silence. "You touched my daughter, my child." And then, one final blow. Grandfather crumpled. Hit the floor. Still, the only sound left was Papa's ragged breathing and the storm outside, beating against the walls. I stood there, hands shaking, trying to believe what I'd just seen. Not because I was afraid, but because for the first time it was over. He didn't get back up. My grandfather lay on the kitchen floor, motionless. The side of his head was bleeding. His chest didn't rise. His eyes, still open, stared into nothing. Papa knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. Waiting. Nothing. A low sound escaped Papa's throat. Not quite a word. Not quite a sob. Something raw and stunned. I watched him pull back slowly, sitting on his heels, staring at the man who had haunted our home for so long. And then he looked at me. His eyes weren't angry. They were broken. He whispered. Did he? How long I didn't answer. I couldn't. He looked down, covered his face with his hands. Then something in him seemed to settle. He stood, walked to the sink, washed the blood from his hands with water that ran far too long. Then he dried them on a towel, turned to me, and said quietly, "We'll say it was an accident." I stared at him. "Are you sure?" I asked. Voice barely a whisper. His jaw clenched. "If they find out the truth, they'll take you, and Rosie, and Paul. You'll be separated. They'll call it a broken home. They'll ask why I didn't stop it sooner." He knelt in front of me then, gently taking my hands in his. "I should have known," he said, "and I didn't. That's on me. But this is how I protect you now." We stayed there for a long time, in the quiet hum of that kitchen, beside a body no one would mourn. That night, we made a pact, a promise of silence, not because the truth didn't matter, but because, in that moment, survival mattered more. The official story was simple. He fell, slipped while fixing a loose shelf in the pantry, hit his head on the edge of the table. No one was home but me. Papa came back to find him already gone. It was a story with just enough detail, just enough sadness, just enough truth to be believed. The sheriff came and took notes in a small, leather-bound book. He glanced at the bruise on my wrist once, then looked away. The coroner said it was consistent with a fall. New questions asked. The neighbors came by with casseroles and cookies, murmuring polite condolences. Such a shame. They said he was a tough old man, quiet, but loyal. No one asked what he was doing in the pantry at night. No one wondered why Papa wouldn't let them see the body. We buried him 2 days later. There was no preacher, no long speeches, just a few words from Papa, spoken low, like a man trying to bury more than a body. He wasn't perfect, Papa said, staring at the closed casket. But he was family. I stood beside him, silent, holding Rosie's hand. Paul stared at the sky like he couldn't quite understand why the world kept spinning. And just like that, he was gone. Gone from the house, from our days, from the air itself, but not from me. Not yet. The house felt different after the funeral. Quieter. Somehow, not just in sound, but in weight. The kind of silence that comes after a storm when things are still broken, but the wind has finally stopped howling. Rosie and Paul went to bed early. I stayed up, sitting at the kitchen table, tracing the pattern in the wood with my fingertip. Papa came in after midnight. He didn't say anything at first, just poured himself a cup of coffee, though it had long gone cold, and sat across from me. We sat there like that for a while, not speaking, just breathing in the same space for the first time in what felt like forever. Then he said, "You don't have to be afraid anymore." I looked at him. His face was tired, lined with guilt and something deeper, grief. Maybe. Or shame. I should have seen it. He said, "I should have known. I live in this house. I saw you every day. And I missed it." I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that monsters don't always show their teeth. But I couldn't speak. He reached across the table and gently took my hand. "I love you, Ellie," he said, voice steady. "And from now on, no one will ever hurt you like that again. Not while I'm breathing." I looked at him, then really looked, and I believed him. And for the first time in years, I felt safe. Not because the past was erased, but because someone had finally said it out loud, "You're worth protecting." That summer felt different. Not perfect. Not healed. But quieter. Softer. Like our house had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Papa changed. Slowly, but clearly. He started getting up earlier. Making breakfast before we came downstairs. He didn't ask if we wanted help with chores, he just rolled up his sleeves and did them. One morning, I found him in the kitchen with flour on his shirt and a cookbook open. Trying to make cornbread. "Smells funny," Paul said. Papa looked up. Sheepish. "I think I used salt instead of sugar." We all laughed. Not loud, but real. Like we didn't have to whisper anymore. Bit by bit. Papa filled the spaces Mama used to hold. He brushed Rosie's hair before church. He helped Paul tie his shoes. He sat beside me at night, reading recipes out loud like bedtime stories. He didn't try to replace her, but he tried to keep us from falling apart. And somehow, that was enough. There were still shadows. There were still nights when I woke up sweating, and mornings when the weight in my chest felt unbearable. But there was also banana bread on Sundays, a mended curtain in the hallway, a father learning how to mother. We didn't call it healing. We didn't call it anything at all. But we were still standing, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like a miracle. Going back to school was like stepping onto a stage where everyone else already knew their lines. The hallways buzzed with laughter and secrets. Girls in ribboned braids whispered about boys. Teachers clapped hands for quiet. Life had carried on without me, and I wasn't sure I remembered how to be part of it. I walked with my shoulders tight, eyes low, always scanning, always listening. I didn't trust closed doors, didn't trust loud voices, didn't trust kindness. Either. Not yet. The teachers welcomed me back gently. "You've gotten taller." One said. "Still love books," another smiled. I nodded. I didn't say much. My voice felt like something that belonged to someone else. At recess, I sat beneath the oak tree alone. I liked the bark at my back, the solidity, the way no one could sneak up behind me. Some girls waved, but I only gave half smiles. I didn't know how to be close. Not anymore. But I was there. I showed up. I turned in my work. I passed my tests. I raised my hand when I knew the answer. I kept going, even when my legs felt like iron. And slowly, I began to find my rhythm again. Not joy. Not yet. But something like permission to exist in this world, to take up space again, to relearn safety. It was not the beginning of healing. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of beginning. It started with a book. Mrs. Chandler, my English teacher, handed me a copy of Jane Eyre and said, "You remind me of her quiet, but strong." I read it in 3 nights. There was something about Jane, how she endured, how she questioned, how she refused to be erased, that made me feel like I wasn't so strange after all. Mrs. Chandler noticed. Then Mr. Harlan, the math teacher, started leaving little logic puzzles on my desk with a wink. "You've got a sharp mind, Ellie. Let's keep it busy." And it worked. I began looking forward to lessons not just because they distracted me, but because they made me feel capable, seen. In the classroom, I wasn't the girl who disappeared for a while. I wasn't someone to pity. I was someone who could solve equations, write essays, ask questions that stumped the teacher. The other students began to notice, too. A boy named Daniel asked to sit next to me in science. A girl named Clara asked if I wanted to read together after class. I didn't say yes right away. But I didn't say no. Either. There were still days I folded into myself. Still moments when noise felt like danger and light felt too bright. But in between all that, something else was taking root. Confidence. It was small, quiet, but it was there, like a seed pushing through cold earth. When Papa told us we were moving to Fairview to live with Aunt Louise, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was scared. New town, new school, new people. But another part quiet, hopeful, felt something close to relief. Fairview was greener than home. The streets were paved, the houses close together, and the air smelled less like animals and more like rain on stone. Aunt Louise welcomed us with open arms. Her house was small but warm, filled with books and soft rugs and the smell of cinnamon. She'd cleared out a room just for me, white curtains, a wooden desk, shelves already waiting for my notebooks. "This is yours," she said, squeezing my shoulder. The school in Fairview was bigger, stricter, uniforms, rules, assigned seats, but also a library 3 times the size of the one back home, science labs, a debate team, teachers who looked you in the eye and waited for real answers. It felt serious. It felt like possibility. I kept to myself at first. New girls stared, whispered. I didn't blame them. I was quiet, different. But I listened. I watched. I studied harder than anyone. And slowly, they stopped staring and started nodding when I passed in the hallway. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just trying to become someone I could live with. And in Fairview, for the first time in my life, that felt possible. Fairview Girls Academy wasn't the kind of place you blended into. The girls there walked in neat lines, spoke with crisp vowels, and carried themselves like they'd been trained for something bigger than childhood. They weren't mean, but they weren't quick to welcome outsiders either. I kept my head down and my books close. My uniform never looked quite right. My shoes were too scuffed. My hair too plain. I didn't know how to speak their language, the subtle glances, the shared jokes, the way they made confidence look effortless. Still, I listened. I watched. I learned. And most of all, I read. The school library became my haven. I'd slip in during lunch or stay after class, just to touch the spines of old novels. Austen, Alcott, Dickinson. Their words lit small fires inside me. Stories made sense in a way people didn't. In books, girls like me could be heroines. They could speak and fight, run, fail, and still matter. That's where I began to find myself, not in whispers or clicks, but in paragraphs and paper. Miss Bennett, the literature teacher, took notice. "You have a way with words," she said one day, tapping the margin of my essay. "You write like you've seen too much and survived it." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. From that moment on, I wasn't just a quiet girl from nowhere. I was Ellie who wrote, Ellie who knew things, Ellie who carried stories like armor. They got married on a Tuesday. No white dress. No music. No long procession. Just a quiet ceremony at the courthouse, with Rosie holding flowers picked from the backyard and Paul in his only button-up shirt. I stood beside Papa as he slipped a simple gold band onto Aunt Louise's finger. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady, calm, certain. And somehow, in that small room with peeling paint and echoing footsteps, something sacred happened. They didn't say forever like some people do. They said, "We'll do our best." And for us, that was more than enough. Afterward, we went home and ate peach pie that Aunt Louise had baked the night before. Papa served it with whipped cream and shy smiles. And Rosie kept saying, "Now, we really are a family." And we were. Life settled into something gentle after that. Aunt Louise, now Mama Louise, taught me how to hem skirts and measure sugar by feel. She let me help her knead dough, press patterns into pies, and balance checkbooks. But she also sat with me during algebra homework. She corrected my grammar with a wink. She showed me how a woman could be soft and sharp at the same time. We didn't talk much about the past, but we talked about books, about futures, about how to sew strong seams and stronger hearts. In that house in Fairview, I was no longer just surviving. I was becoming. It took me a long time to say the words out loud, even longer to believe someone would listen. It was a quiet evening. The house smelled like cinnamon rolls, and rain tapped gently at the windows. Aunt Louise and I were folding laundry, side by side. The radio played soft piano in the background. And then, just like that, the words came out. He touched me. I whispered. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. She just folded another shirt and placed it in the basket. Then she said, "I know." I looked at her. My throat burned. She took a deep breath and sat down on the couch, her hands resting in her lap. "He started with me when I was 9. She said. Mama didn't want to believe it, so I stopped telling her. I thought maybe it was just me. Something about me. Tears welled in my eyes. Not just for me, but for her. She went on, her voice steady, almost clinical. He was careful. He always was. Kind to everyone else. Cruel only in private. I thought I was going crazy. I said, "You weren't." She replied, "You were surviving." We sat in silence for a while. Then she reached out and took my hand. "You are not what he did to you, Ellie," she said. "You never were." And for the first time, I let myself cry without shame. Because someone else knew the truth. Because someone else had carried it too, and survived. Healing wasn't a straight road. It was slow, uneven, like walking barefoot across gravel, painful at times. But never without movement. I poured myself into school. Books became my sanctuary, my compass. I found joy in structure, in learning, in the quiet thrill of mastering things that once felt too big. It was Miss Bennett who first said it. "You'd make a wonderful teacher, Ellie." The thought stuck. Teaching, passing on what I'd fought so hard to claim, helping others find their voice, their place, their strength. By graduation, I'd made up my mind. I would become the kind of adult I had once needed. College was another world, bigger, faster, louder. But I held my ground. I studied, worked nights in the library, wrote essays that carried pieces of my past between the lines. And then, one rainy morning, I met Anthony. He was in his 3rd year of med school. Tall, thoughtful, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from fear, but from listening. He asked about my favorite author before he asked about my hometown. I told him about Dickinson. He told me about anatomy. And somehow, it worked. We married in the spring, under blooming dogwoods and cloudy skies. There was no drama, no spectacle, just soft vows, shared promises, and hands that had learned to hold gently. For the first time, I looked at a man and did not flinch. Because Anthony didn't want to own me, he simply wanted to walk beside me. I thought the hard part was over. I had survived the house. I had found love, purpose, a home that didn't hurt to wake up in. I had built a life. But life isn't a straight line. It curves, bends, breaks even when you think you've earned peace. Anthony died on a Tuesday. A sudden heart attack. No warning. No goodbye. One moment he was here, smiling at me across the dinner table. The next, the world went quiet again. Grief is a strange echo. It brings back every loss you thought you'd buried. But I didn't break this time. I mourned him. God. I mourned him. But I also stood up the next morning and made coffee. I packed lunches. I taught my students. I breathed. Because I knew something I hadn't known as a child. I am strong. Not because I don't cry, but because I do and keep going. I still wear Anthony's wedding band on a chain around my neck. I still read Dickinson on rainy mornings. I still speak gently to the girl I once was, the one hiding in barns. The one who thought silence was safety. And I tell her, you made it. You made it through fear, shame, loss, and love. You made it into a woman who chooses kindness without weakness, who leads with compassion but stands like stone when she must. This is not a story about what was taken. It's a story about what was built from the ashes, from the quiet, from the girl who survived. I would tell her that the scars will never fully fade, but in time, they can become marks of honor, silent testaments of battles survived, of courage found in the darkest places. And more than anything, I would tell her this: she is not alone. There are still good people in the world, people who reach out, who listen, who stay. And even when we do not understand his ways, God never leaves us. This is my story, a story of pain, yes, but also one of redemption. A story about how faith holds us steady in life's most violent storms. A story that, perhaps, might offer a glimmer of hope to someone who right now is walking through their own valley of shadows, wondering if they'll ever see light again. If you're going through something like that, I want you to know you are not alone. The wounds that ache today may one day become part of your strength. You are stronger than you think, more loved than you know, and your story is far from over. If this story touched your heart even a little, please share it with someone who might need it today. Click like so that more people can find it. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories of faith, resilience, and healing, because in the end, this is what saves us. Knowing we are not alone in our suffering, that others have walked through valleys like ours and found their way back to the light. May God walk with you today and every day.